How does that look? Wonderful, thank you. Thank you again. It's an honor to be here with you this morning in Memphis, Tennessee, in the United States. I'm going to let Swasti say a welcome as well, and then we'll get started.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fritz, and the rest of the committee and people that have helped put this together. We know it's a lot of work, and thank you. And this opportunity for Bernie and I to share our project with you all. And we're particularly interested in sharing it with this community because we've stumbled upon this because of our different, I mean, we're both in religious studies, but we come at it from different areas. And it's been a lot of fun, and we're really looking forward to the comments and feedback that you'll have for us, because we presented this at Thomas Merton Societies, but not out of that. So thank you very much, and we'll get started. So Vinoba Bhave was a disciple, confidant, spiritual friend, and spiritual successor to Mahatma Gandhi. Well, Gandhi negotiated for peace and India's independence on a world stage. Vinoba led very quietly led the movement quietly from the inside. He was focusing his work on the social and educational reform amongst the common people. He rejected calls to take up political office, and actually, upon Gandhi's assassination, the nation looked to Vinobaji for leadership, and he refused to take up that mantle of any kind of political involvement because he felt politics was about power, and he was about people and the holistic uplifting of all, from the lowest to the poorest to the richest, to uplift everybody, and that's that Sarvodaya. Vinoba is generally not very well known outside of Gandhian circles. However, his contributions to the Gandhian movement, to India's campaign for nonviolence, and to spirituality in India are numerous. However, for the intro for him tonight, we've decided to focus on three different elements of note from his life. The first is this idea of this first Satyagrahi. In 1940, when Gandhi launched his first Satyagraha movement, that nonviolent campaign to free India from British rule, he asked Vinoba to physically lead it. And at the time, he wrote a piece to kind of introduce Vinoba to the nation because they didn't really know who he was. And he identifies him as his son. The second thing we want to focus on is the Buddhan Yagna. So in 1951, Vinoba was at a meeting, and a group of landless peasants came up to him and asked him to take a petition to the government to enable them to get some land so that they could farm and be self-sufficient. And he was thinking about that, and he thought, well, he's willing to do that, but then that would help these people, but what about the other people in India that are landless and that are poor? And in that same meeting, Mr. Reddy stood up and offered them 100 acres. And he was so moved by this, this act of great generosity that he was inspired to launch this Buddhan Yagna. And this was a 13-year land redistribution campaign. And while Vinoba wanted to address the issues of poverty with this Buddhan Yagna, his ultimate aim was to transform the hearts and the minds of India's people to apply Sarvodaya, that holistic uplifting of all life on a national level to everybody. And then the third thing we want to focus on is that he was the author of the talks on the Gita. So in 1930, in the 1930s, when Vinoba was thrown into jail with a bunch of these other Gandhian freedom fighters, they were sitting there and he would bring them together and he would start lecturing on the Bhagavad Gita. So these lectures were compiled into a commentary on the Gita that for him, it's called, in Hindi, it's called the Gita Pravachan. And then in English, it's called the Talks on the Gita. And this text has been translated into over 30 languages, and it's appreciated by people around the world. It is the English 1960 Macmillan publication that Merton receives from his friend Lax. Now, just a comment on these photographs. I've been interviewing the people of Vinoba's ashram at the Brahma Vidya Mandir for about 20 years now. And one of the members, kind of a member, his name is Gautam Bai. His family was a supporter of Vinoba and the movement. And from the age of 12, he was on the Bhutan and working with Vinoba. And he gives me all these, I think it was in 2010, he gave me like 19 gigabytes worth of these photographs that he's taken. He says, there's no copyright on them, you can use them. And so we're using them, and they're actually available on the web as well. So
Thomas Merton was a prominent, prolific 20th century American Catholic thinker. He was born in France in 1915, 6 months after the start of World War I, and he died in Thailand in 1968, when the United States had been in the Vietnam War for more than a decade. For the majority of Merton's adult life, from the age of 26, he lived as a Cistercian monk in the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemane near Louisville, Kentucky. And an image of the monastery is at the top right side of the screen. He served there for many years as novice master and teacher to the new monks. In the last 3 years of his life, he lived permanently in a hermitage on the grounds of the monastery, where he continued to correspond with a number of close confidants and friends, and to write and publish works about spirituality, nonviolence, and interreligious dialogue. He is widely remembered popularly as the author of The Seven-Story Mountain, an autobiography of faith, which was published in 1948. It's an early book in a very sizable corpus in which he recalls his childhood, his education, his conversion to Catholicism, and his call to the monastic life. Researchers are fortunate to have access to Merton's extant works through the archives that are housed at the Thomas Merton Society on the campus of Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. And we're particularly grateful for the archival assistance and ongoing support of Dr. Paul Pearson, who's the director of the Merton Center, and who made available a scan of Merton's marked up copy of Talks on the Gita that you can see on the center's website. We know that Merton encountered Hinduism in college at Columbia University, where he read Hindu texts alongside Christian spiritual classics, considered William Blake's reading of the Bhagavad Gita, and befriended the Hindu monk Brahmachari. It is likely that Merton gained a basic understanding of core Hindu concepts in these encounters. This foundation would serve him well when in the late 1950s, he grew increasingly interested in learning more about South Asian religious traditions. For the first time, we see Merton bringing concepts into his writings and published works. Svadharma appears in a number of these sources. Our evidence for Merton's early engagement with Svadharma comes from his journals and letters. These works were unpublished during Merton's lifetime. As we review these sources, we must remember that neither were written with the intent of public audience or consumption. By definition, journals and letters are private, personal discursive spaces for reflection and consideration. So when we enter these spaces, we do so with care, attentive not only to what is said, but also to what is silent.
And just to give you a taste of the personality of Merton and his thoughts on Vinoba, we wanted to read something that Merton wrote about Vinoba. I think this Vinoba is one of the very, very few men of our age, of our time, age, or generation, who has been blessed by the good God with a few grains of sense. And for this reason, I predict the abject failure of his book, The Talks on the Gita, in the United States of America. And I just love that playfulness there. And you'll see that as we continue. And just a note, I have loved working with Bernie on this project. And it came about because we were just kind of flippantly talking about Merton and Vinoba. And I was like, oh, we wonder if they even ever met. And we then have launched into this thing where we're finding more and more, and it's just a lot of fun to dig in this and to learn. So
So with that context in mind, for the past little over 2 years, we've been working on Merton's encounter with Vinoba, in particular through talks on the Gita. Although Merton's reading of the text was concentrated in the period 1960 to 1962, he refers to the text on a number of occasions up until his death in 1968. Of the many interesting elements that we are finding in this interfaith encounter, today's presentation focuses specifically on how he engaged with Svadharma from 1958 to 1962, in particular through his reading of talks on the Gita. In Merton's reflections on the book, we see glimpses of a developing understanding of Svadharma as he reflects on the relationship between thought and action in his own life. This evidence suggests that he may have moved from an intellectual understanding to an applied understanding of Svadharma. Through his interaction with the text, we see him firmly committing to action that facilitates one's playing a useful role in society. We argue that Merton's reading and reflections contributed to this shift because it provided him with an opportunity to deepen his exploration in Svadharma. So far as we can tell, the first reference to the word Svadharma in Merton's writings appears in a journal entry on the 26th of September in 1958. In this entry, Merton writes about his recent visit to Louisville, Kentucky, where he had several meetings about upcoming publishing projects and spent time at the local library. Among the items he read, he recalls this one, including a parenthetical note. After that, had a good day in the library, some C.F. Andrews on Gandhi, the concept of Svadharma, important for me. In this journal entry, Merton refers to Svadharma as a concept. Furthermore, he signifies its personal relevance. As we'll see, Merton's observation about the relevance of Svadharma will prove foundational in later references.
So in August of 1960, Merton was in the middle of a vocational crisis. He had requested a transfer and been denied to a transfer to another monastery in Mexico, where he wanted to cultivate more of a hermetic lifestyle. He continued to question his role in the monastery and to evaluate his growing need for more solitude. He corresponded with several of his friends and confidants that were outside of the monastery about his situation. And they encouraged him to kind of resubmit his request for a transfer. And he did so on August 17th, 1960. 2 days later, on the 19th of August, he starts to read the talks on the Gita. In his journal entry for the 20th, and that's where he said, yesterday I started to read, he records and reflects on the passage about non-attachment from the book. And it's on page 32 of the talks on the Gita, the copy that he had. Then on August 21, he reflects again on his situation, referring to himself as a political prisoner at Gethsemane, a prisoner of my own inability to act. He considers whether and how he should act. Hence the need to consider my Svadharma, to doubt, first of all, whether it consists primarily in thinking. Yet it does, in clarification in the Confucian sense, but clarification through and by right action, and I can't act. As Merton ponders his own Svadharma, he affirms that it is personally relevant and extends his understanding to include action. Merton's reflection continues in the journal entry for the 22nd of August. And here he draws a connection between a quote that we actually referred to later that Knight then mentions, and he makes a connection between Knight and Vinoba's talks on the Gita. Knight says, the modern sage is not to be simply an eccentric, But if he is ever again to play a useful role in society, he must learn to be wise in action rather than in meditation. Merton acknowledges that one can easily quarrel with this in some ways and in different ideas, but then he goes on to say, but this agrees with Vinoba, and it is something I have come to admit in spite of myself. Can that mean that meditation was once for me an evasion from action? I know it certainly is so here for many, and that's why meditation is blank. As Merton wonders whether meditation was once for me an evasion from action, he challenges himself to evaluate further his own Svadharma.
On the same day, Merton writes a letter to Robert Lax that demonstrates his willingness to situate Svadharma more firmly in his personal context. We will illustrate this in a close shared reading of a section of this letter. In the letter, Merton explains that he is happy to tears with talks on the Gita, calling it a sage volume. He tells Lax that he is reading it reflectively when he writes,
I take it under the trees constantly, and I sit on my can and muse.
Merton indicates that he's applying its teachings critically and personally when he asks,
can this be my Svadharma, namely sitting here and looking at the clouds? That we all know dharma is a really complicated term to define, but in this sense, in this context, it's basically referring to our duty or to duty. And then Svadharma, according to the Gita and to Vinoba, is one's own personal duty, right? And in the Gita, you're supposed to follow that. Even if it seems devoid of merit, it is the best for oneself.
Merton then suggests that he is willing to suspend judgment and to be open to a response to the challenges posed by the text's teachings when he admits,
with the result that I'm not sure.
Merton indicates that his reading influences how he evaluates his personal situation, stating,
I am faced at last with the unfortunate conviction that I am placed atop a tall, spiky tree out on the limb's end and fruitless, which of course is all right, except for the immense desire for fruit.
He thinks that the text also names clearly a contemporary collective situation when he contends that
unless we fellas get busy and start on Vikarma, we're all going to be left up to the chin in a deluge of woeful without a word of explanation. Now, remember, again, this audience, we're assuming knows these terms, just as a reminder, karma is that concrete action, right? That outward action that's performed, whereas Vikarma is that attitude with which we perform or with which we act. Vikarma talks about, or Vinoba, talks about how we bow our heads to somebody. But if when we're doing this, our heart too does not bow, then the act is meaningless. The inner and the outer must become one. In the talks on the Gita, Vinoba writes that Vikarma is applied to karma. When Vikarma is applied to karma, desirelessness comes into being. He then uses this metaphor of gunpowder, and he says the spark touches gunpowder, it explodes. The power is released from the gunpowder. The mere act, the karma, is the powder, which is activated by the fire, the feeling of Vikarma. The power that karma develops is at the touch of Vikarma is indescribable.
Near the conclusion of his letter, Merton avows that he is determined to respond to the text's teachings completely when he concludes,
but whatever it is, man, intend to do it, as Vinoba said.
our close reading of this section of Merton's letter highlights his emergent awareness of Swadharma as concretely connected to karma and vikarma. Merton did act. At the end of this year, he remained at Gethsemane, and he was able to spend more time in the hermitage. Later references to Swadharma would further deepen his attention to the role of action in the context of continued social upheaval and change. Merton did not finish reading talks on the Gita until 1962. He was still at Gethsemane and he was still seeking increased solitude. When he returns to the text on the 27th of August, he refers to the book again as a most practical and meaningful book about the conduct of life. The Vietnam War was in its 7th year. Merton reflects on the state of nuclear testing and his own need to study and practice nonviolence.
So Merton continued to read the talks on the Gita over the following months, and his reading including more teachings on Swadharma from chapter 14, section 78. And we're fortunate to have the scanned pages of the actual copy of the talks on the Gita that Merton was reading. And I mean, this is when you know you're kind of nerding out, as both Bernie and I were like, look at this and look at this. So we've actually taken screenshots of it. So, from his marginalia, we see that he's noting Vinoba's words. You can see where he's underlined. We should think constantly of our Swadharma and devote all our energies to it. We should have no thoughts of anything else. In his marking, he's highlighting what Vinoba is teaching about the relationship between Swadharma and non-attachment, that without any other fruits.
Swadharma is also featured in the following section of this chapter. Here, Vinoba instructs that Swadharma comes naturally of itself. It is born into the world with us. Merton's pencil markings from these 2 pages of chapter 14 indicate his own close engagement with a number of core teachings. That Swadharma is central to one's identity, we see on page 199 and again here, on 198 and again on 199, when he says, when a man is born, his Swadharma too is born with him. We see the idea of the performance naturally and inescapably without attachment to the fruits. And we see that the cultivation of Swadharma in this way leads to an inner purity. According to these teachings, Swadharma is neither sought nor found. It is a part of one's very being. These teachings emphasize Swadharma as lived. It is neither solely concept nor action, but an expression of both in a context of truth.
So in November 1962, the United States was engaged in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Merton appears to draw a relationship between Swadharma and nonviolence when he includes this nearly direct quotation from page 266 of the talks on the Gita in his journal entry. And this is all that's in his journal entry at the time. So if you see the part that's underlined, that's the talks on the Gita. His journal entry says, it is impossible to get rid of violence when one is oneself full of violence. On the contrary, one only adds to the number of the violent. When these 1962 journal entries are viewed alongside the corresponding text of the talks on the Gita, we see how Merton is working to apply Vinoba's teachings about Swadharma as connected to karma and vikarma in a life of nonviolence.
Through Merton's careful reading of Vinoba's talks on the Gita, we see a powerful example of what can come from engaging in interfaith intersections. Merton's use of Swadharma demonstrates this. He allows the concept from a different worldview to influence not only how he thought, but how he lived. His very engagement with Svadharma demonstrates interfaith dialogue as a viable framework for pursuing truth, something central to both Vinoba and Merton. Thank you.
Thank you.